We are now live. And welcome everyone. We are once again live for a debrief on our podcast, our Seven Sisters podcast about interpreters called Not Quite Magic. We are now live. I've done this. This is the second time I've done this. The second time that we've live streamed from Zoom into YouTube, and the second time that I've played that on my phone and then it comes into my microphone. So today we're going to talk about the interview with Bindiya Jha that I did and that went live last week. And Bindiya is a Nepali interpreter. So she was the first interviewee that I had who works with what we call in the business language of lesser diffusion. Some people talk about it, as a rare language, but it's a language that's not used as often in interpreting. There's less people that speak it, less people that need interpreters, at least in the given market that we're talking about. And she works as a Nepali interpreter out of Massachusetts. She works primarily in the healthcare field. And she decided to go remote, which again is the topic of this season of the podcast. She decided to become a remote interpreter about over a year ago now. So before the pandemic, because she wanted to try out something new and she wanted to. She talked about this actually extensively in the interview, that one of the main reasons that she wanted to do it was because her students were coming to her, and she trains interpreters as well, and her students were coming to her wanting to know more about remote, and she didn't have any experience with it, and so she wanted to be able to teach from experience, and not just from what she read or heard from other people. So that was pretty cool, and she started doing it as a video remote interpreter in healthcare. And in the interview, she talked a lot about those really unique experiences, intense experiences that she had as an interpreter. Before I ask, you, Liz and Laura, what you thought of this particular episode, I wanted to remind everyone what's coming up. So we're still on the first season of this podcast. I'm still loving it. So we're still going to keep producing it. And the next interview that I'm going to post is with Catherine Allen. She is the president of Interpret America, co-founder, and now the only president. And I spoke to her much earlier in April. I spoke to Catherine about remote interpreting. So that's the next one that is going to drop, and that'll be in 2 weeks, which is September 16th. And as I was saying on my story on Instagram, if you don't follow us on Instagram, you should check us out. We have a really, really nice channel that is beautifully curated by Liz Essery. And I posted a story about right before coming on about using some new toys that I have in my home office. And but I'm only using one of them because I waited until the last minute and could not figure out my webcam. So if you saw that post and are looking at the quality, they ignore it because the webcam's sitting here and it's not capturing me. It's still my old webcam. But I am using my very nice mini split air conditioning because I have an office, really nice office that I love in my home. And it's on the third floor of an old house. So it's where the attic used to be. And it is extremely hot and humid in the summer and impossible really to do work in a focused manner and not feel incredibly uncomfortable. And of course, I needed something that wouldn't be loud. So I'm very happy, even though it's not a particularly hot day today. Of course, Murphy's Law. So we do have some people viewing us, so that's good. That's always good. How are things going with, let's just check in briefly. How are things going with you, Liz?
Yeah, things are going great, Elena. Thank you for asking. I always appreciate how we can kind of touch base with how life is when the three of us get together. Things are fine in Houston. I have been getting ready for school to start next week. I'm teaching your and Laura and Catherine's old class, healthcare interpreting class at Glendon, and also teaching in the conference interpreting course for I2B. And that starts next week. And Laura kind of coming down off of a thrill working with doing some work in the virtual booth with Laura from Monday. So yeah, everything is good in these parts.
That's good to hear. I'm having some technical difficulties here with my offspring who don't seem to have understood that they're not to knock on my door. So if you hear anything, that's them. How are you doing, Laura?
I'm doing well, and it's so nice to say that I'm doing well because I'm sure, like anyone's listening, and you all, there's like moments of well and moments of not well. Um, but all in all, I really appreciate having this podcast come out at this time because it has coincided with a lot of from our services side of things, the services we provide, the actual apart from the training, more and more interest and requests around other types of access. So, we heard in the podcast, like from the beginning, Bindiya really framed it as I'm a language access advocate. And that's something I want to look at today in the debrief. It's something I noticed that I feel having had my interpreter start and the bulk of my career in healthcare interpreting. I think Liz and I, when we work together and when I work with you, Elena, like there is this very strong language access underpinning that maybe we can pick that apart and kind of describe what that means to us a little more. That I don't is not present in the same way, I think, in conference interpreting or in the field, just not in the same way. So I'd really love to explore kind of the differences in the way that the fields think about language access. But back to the comment earlier that this coming out access has coincided with a lot of inquiries about live human captioning, CART in inquiries. I'll look up what that exactly stands for, but that's what it is. It's live human captioning. And multilingual captioning and how we can use the tools to really break out beyond. Now I'm seeing our role kind of expand in a way I've never felt it before, to all kinds of different types of access as our technology is beginning to support more sophisticated access options at once.
Yeah, that is a really I really liked that she brought up language access as kind of one of the key words there, and her passion for it as an advocate for that. And again, it's one of those buzzwords in our field that a lot of times people don't recognize, don't know what it means, but it's such an important underpinning to what we do, and really looking at it from a sense of social justice and access to services. It's so crucial. And she comes from from a country that has had a lot of refugees. She works with a community that's primarily refugee community in Massachusetts. And like so many of the interpreters here in Massachusetts and in other states that take refugees in large numbers, and it's often overlooked. People forget about that group of immigrants and their unique needs, and then the unique needs of working with them as an interpreter. Yes, and here's the CART definition: communication, access, real-time translation. Yeah, I saw that a lot when I worked at Bay State Medical Center, where we had CART people come in, and we had a couple of workshops about what they do, and it seemed like a very interesting thing to be able to do into other languages too. It's kind of that combination of stenography and then live captioning, which and then I know it's been, these requests have been kind of popping around since the pandemic of different clients and agencies looking for services that don't really exist as far as I know, right? This live captioning, but I mean translation captioning.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they haven't existed
Right.
traditionally, but they do exist now. It's all a matter of understanding, but all of the tools are aimed at different situations and have different levels of human involvement. It's not even as simple as you can do, you know, human captioning or machine captioning. You can do human interpreting or there's all sorts of. I was just running into this debrief today because I was in a call with a client who had a very interesting mix of needs. And really, I'm seeing, like, for them, the priority was actually Spanish language captioning above Spanish language interpretation. Isn't that interesting? But committed to not trying to, be like, just, do automatic captionings and we'll see what we get. Like, they're committed to actual access, but I just think but they also wanted English captioning. And so there's so many different ways that could be approached. Do you involve a human interpreter and then caption that? And do you use machines or humans? Do I'm sure the guys at Tech Forward would love to weigh in on this conversation, Alex and Josh. Or do you, that we're really going into the weeds here, but we'll go ahead and keep exploring this vein. Or do you, look at a tool like Wordly and see where that fits in, where you're using, speech to text technology, machine translation, and then text to voice, and how does that fit into their needs and the tools at hand? Given where they're going to host the panelists, where they're going to end up streaming to. I mean, it's just a really fascinating, intricate web of layers that's really fun to sort through with people who are looking for these really, like Bindiya says, like these access informed services.
Yeah, and it's that idea of having technology and including AI, right? Artificial intelligence aid us and use it as a tool, right? So the interpreters are not the tools, but the interpreters are using the newer tools and trying to take advantage of it. I mean, I tried it out for this last episode that I edited. I tried using this program that uses AI for transcription, because one of the things is that we want to have our podcasts be available, have the full transcripts of them. And of course, transcripts take a long time to do. And so I used a program called Descript, which allows me to do several things. But the AI part of it is that it'll transcribe your audio or video using artificial intelligence, and it'll identify the different speakers, and it kind of learns from how you change, what changes you make, and it learns to identify your voice and the topics that you talk about, and creates a transcript, which then gets edited by, in this case, again, our wonderful Liz. Thank you, Liz, for doing that. But it's using a tool that I think I hope is that, did that make it easier this time? Although last time I also had it done by a different program.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when I was editing it. I was surprised at how good the transcript was. And there were very few real corrections that I had to make, and most of them were with place names. So normal things that you would expect.
Yeah.
Place names that only came up once. But yeah, I was surprised really at how good it was, and it was very, very useful how it for the most part it identified who was speaking right up until the end where you do the rapid fire question. Then it got a little bit lost, but for the most part it was quite good. It would have taken me a very, very, very long time to transcribe that from nothing.
Right.
So Caitlin had a question on our page. Live captioning, interesting. Is this like subtitling? So this is a very non-expert, explanation, Caitlin. But from my very rudimentary and budding knowledge of this, the way I think about it is you could have live transcription, and that is basically like that's speech to text technology. It is a machine guessing using AI what you're saying and then writing out all those words and transcribing all those words in front of you. Then you have live captioning, which is somewhat it's taking the message that the speaker is given and then putting it's like interpreting and then optimizing it for a read on screen experience, but doing it live, right? Rather than captioners who have the benefit of listening and finding the best way to present that on the screen afterhand. Or yeah, after the fact. And then you asked about subtitling, and generally subtitling, and correct me if you guys have different understandings, Elena and Liz, but that's another layer where you're adding, it's an on-screen experience of what is being said, but in a different language. So that adds in the language component where there might be something said in language A, and then it would be a written version of that optimized for the screen, optimized for reading in language B. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm going to post a link to Josh and Alex, the guys at the team at Tech for Word or Tech for Word, right? That's how I understand they're intending us to pronounce it. That is a link to one of their mini lessons on how automatic live captioning works. And there, they'll present some actual concrete tools. They talk about Google Live Transcribe, another service called Ava, and then Otter AI, which they had explored before. Because I know it's better for these things to have kind of concrete names of tools so that it doesn't feel so ethereal and behind the curtain. So take a look at that to get a little introduction to the topic.
And I have kind of a fuzzy memory of my work when I used to work for an interpreting agency for a while, and we would occasionally get CART requests for people who are hard of hearing but don't use sign language. So, someone in an event or a meeting who a sign language interpreter is not going to work for them because they don't use sign language, but they can read the live captions, like you were saying, Laura, in the, it's like English to English, someone speaking English, and then someone is captioning it live also in English.
This is where I would really like to hear, and I won't spoil anything, Elena, about what we kind of have in the works for future seasons, if you know what we've been discussing. But this is where it would be really nice to have the perspective of someone from the deaf community who relies on, either, what the difference is in the experience for them in using something like CART versus a sign language interpreter, as a means for communication, so bookmark that idea for an interview.
I will. Live captioning, I think it's like what you said, the main difference between that and subtitles is that it's live, you're doing it on the run, as it's happening. It's similar to interpreting versus someone dubbing. You could compare it almost to those two things where, a dubbed version of a movie or a talk is going to be something that's prepared ahead of time. Then a professional is going to, voiceover artist is going to do it. Subtitles are translated. The deadlines are pretty short from what I understand, but they're done by a professional who specializes in subtitling. They have more time. They're not doing it live. And there's I took a course many years ago. One of the first courses that I took in subtitling when I was living in Brazil, and in subtitling, and it was quite good. And it is a whole art to it, how many characters per line, how many lines you have. It's, and it really is another version, which of course we know translation is always another version, but it's, in movie language, you have the visual, when we have the movie, and then the subtitles are kind of because they're always a little bit of a summary, they take out kind of the extra. And then live captioning, and also, what you see on television, like on the news, is also live captioning, right? And that, that's done on the fly, and you see mistakes in there all the time. Like, if you've ever watched it, as you see the typos, because that's somebody typing it in. And it's similar to stenography in that they have special keys, and, they're not typing. They're, they have, it's a whole
They're
job.
consecutive note taking and then broadcasting it.
Yeah.
Kind of. Like long
Yeah.
consec, right?
Like long consec, yeah.
Long consec in their own language. Like
Yeah,
that's exactly the
true.
process that we're going through in long consecutive, is like distilling meaning using.
Yeah, they have less time, but yes. And then the what was the last thing that I was going to say? I forgot. It'll come back. Something about the liveness of it, where you have, forget it. I can't think of it. I can't bring it back.
Well, no, I can bring it forward, and and then we'll get back to some of the very interesting things raised in the podcast. But I also wanted to mention, when it comes to subtitling, yes, traditionally that has been done as a translation exercise, right? So, with time after the fact, and then after the fact of the utterance made, right? Or from an actual transcript of the spoken material. But even as something as ubiquitous as PowerPoint, Microsoft PowerPoint, you can turn on, without any paid features, live subtitling, which means the presenter, if I have a PowerPoint and I'm presenting my PowerPoint in English, I can turn on live subtitling for several different languages. I don't have the number. And what I'm saying will appear in Spanish as live machine subtitles on top of the PowerPoint. So it's really interesting to think about how those tools are going to be really important for some contexts, especially, and this is where it gets tricky with languages of lesser diffusion. It's like, those are the places that maybe demand less services, have less interpreters actually available in the right place at the right time in the right way, right? Where these tools for certain circumstances could be really meaningful in increasing language access. And then I'm also interested in these tools as far as how they can make me be a more accurate interpreter.
Right. And that's what I've heard some people talking about, especially for numbers and for all the, not for place names, but for things like numbers and facts that, it's an extra, it's similar to that interesting technique that some court interpreters use. You've probably heard of this, where they record, it's consecutive interpreting. I think somebody coined it simulconsec. I can't remember if that was Esther Diaz
Like
or not.
consecutaneous.
Yeah, consecutive. Somebody else called it consecutaneous. Yeah, and so you record.
Mm-hmm.
It's a consecutive dialogue, but you record the person as they're speaking, and then you play it back in your ear while you consecutively render it. Right, so it's after the fact, but you're listening to it again, and you're now doing simultaneous. And the advantage is that now you're hearing it for the second time, which is pretty cool. And and then of course the whole idea of written versus spoken. And I did a really neat event locally in February, and they asked for the recording of the interpreters, which is another issue that comes up a lot among interpreters. And we let them, we gave them the recording, but then when it kind of came time to really talk about because they wanted to use it for their archive, it was for a college, and then they were like, well, we also want to put it on our Facebook and our website. It was an activist, an Indigenous activist. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, I mean, live interpreting is only as good as live interpreting gets, right? So it's odd, I think, to put a recording out there of somebody, of an interpreter, because it's not going to be the same quality as a dubbed, video. And it was two interpreters, so you've got the voices switching, which I think if you're at a live event, psychologically people are used to this. They're very forgiving, they get it, they know it's live, the person's there. But then to see a recording, it just doesn't work. And I think the listener, the user experience is inferior, and probably they end up questioning the interpreter's competence a lot more. And of course it's difficult for us to do it, but is more the user experience I was thinking about. Anyway, and I thought about it some more, and convinced them to have it subtitled, because I didn't want it to be, for the first thought was like, oh, we could dub it, I could listen to it and then retape it, and do a better job and just have one person. And I was like, no, I want everyone to hear this person's voice, right? The literal voice. And then they can read the very nicely done subtitles. Because that experience, this is a really important activist from an Indigenous community. And to have some, a native English voice over her image, a native English voice over her image, I just didn't think would do it justice. And this way you get to hear the full force of her words in her tone of voice, but then you can read below for the meaning and not listen to the interpreter's, imperfect rendition, as perfect as it was. So yes, how can Laura, you're always really good at steering us back to what should we talk about more about Bindiya? What can we
Well, what I really loved about what she presented is there's a couple of main themes to tease out and put on the table that I'd love to hear whoever's watching. I don't know. I want feedback from the whole community, not just us, about this. But one thing is about Bindiya's evolution. I don't want to call it an evolution, but just the blocks in her career, the underpinnings of working with refugees. So doing refugee resettlement. Right? And how in that work, you often, my husband actually, his first job after the Peace Corps was in refugee resettlement. And he, and now he cringes and tells stories about how he feels so bad that he was put in the position to interpret often and had no training whatsoever in interpreting, along with a whole host of other responsibilities that are leaning towards what we might call the advocate role in interpreting, right? This model of the advocate role. And so I think it's really interesting to think about how it must have been a fascinating, difficult, rewarding combination of career elements, given that, she spends all of her time advocating for families, helping them get what they need at so many levels as a refugee resettlement caseworker, and then how to deal with that as you step into the interpreting role, or how to properly interpret when you're already in that refugee resettlement role. And the reason I want to talk about that is because, for example, I just landed in not just because everything is delayed in my inbox, but a little while ago in my inbox, did you all see the survey from the National Board, IMIA National Board for Certification of Medical Interpreters? They sent out a survey wanting to hear about interpreters' experience. It's specifically a survey built, I haven't filled it out yet, but I am going to try because I like to support surveys and research, but built around the advocate role that's written into the IMIA Code of Ethics. So they're revisiting that. And of course, we've had other email inquiries that have been passed around. I think there's a reckoning as a field about how we can better define or not define, what that aspect of the work that we do, which we obviously do in some form or fashion, how to think about that, how to talk about that, how to train to that as a field, and how it needs to be reconsidered. So that's one, the advocate, crossover that she talked a lot about. And the other main theme I want to talk about is that how in her heart unbelievably clear it is to her that how remote technologies have truly not only enabled additional access for the people that she works with, but also given her as an interpreter more work. So it's been a win-win in her case. The example of being able to do video remote interpreting for labor and delivery in the middle of the night. In a language that not a lot of not a lot of interpreters are available necessarily for that language, and she certainly couldn't be at the hospital at that time. So those are the two big topics I want to hear from you all about.
Yeah, those are really interesting. And I'm reminded of the term that's used in parts of Europe. And I want to say in Italy, this is also the term that they don't have interpreters, but they have mediators. And I could be wrong. So if anyone listening, or if you two know, they don't have anything that they call interpreters. And I'm pretty sure what they call it is a mediator. And then the idea of a navigator, right? So an interpreter, navigator, there's the fixer, right? For the military interpreters.
And for the press.
And for the press. Oh, really? For the press too. And so they do all kinds of extra, things that would be considered, to a certain extent, they would be considered advocacy, although, it'd be interesting to see what they say on that survey. I'll look at it if I got it. What they say about advocacy, because the way I've always taught it is that it's a lot more limited than people think. And it's really not about doing advocacy, the type of work that Bindiya did as a refugee resettlement person, because it's really about imminent harm. It's about when there's something happening right there. And it just gives you that little bit of room that I think really all interpreters have, but court interpreters in particular are just adamant about not letting that in.
And of course, the Canadian Code of Ethics as well is another place
where the Canadian Code of Ethics for healthcare.
That's where we as trainers try to talk about. Yeah, that's a really helpful way for anyone who's listening to kind of conceive of this. That really all they're doing is they're saying, okay, we have our professional code of ethics. There's a human code of ethics that should supersede, in these very rare cases, a professional code of ethics. But in case there's any doubt, we're going to kind of write that into our professional code so that it doesn't have to be so at conflict, with.
Exactly.
Is that the way you think of it? Yeah.
In a hospital, it's, they're about to, in the example is in the National Council Standards of Practice, they're about to inject somebody with something that, with something that that patient's allergic to, you speak out. And in the courtroom, you see somebody, with a gun, raise a gun. It's like, and it's a very narrow thing, which I think, I think it's just people talk about it differently in the courtroom. It's like, well, that's just a human thing to do. But it's nice that in healthcare in the US, we have it in there in both of those codes, right? The IMIA code and the National Council on
Which does not simplify things necessarily, because our own personal human moral codes of ethics can vary greatly and wildly. And that's where we've been starting, but we really need to do a really great job to examine more thoroughly our own personal biases, our own personal beliefs, and try to tease out, what is responding to to our duties as humans, regardless of our biases and political and moral belief. Well, yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, and it's but it's, I think that the important piece that's so fragmented, and one of the reasons it's so confusing, is the training. There's no consensus on what educators are telling their students. because there is no standard for training, and we all know from healthcare interpreting, which I know is its own niche, but the idea that certification for interpreters should not happen before we have certification for or set standards for training, right? So how do you have an exam but you don't have standards for how people train, and what do they need, and what would you have in an exam? But anyway, that's
But there
an
are
older.
standards. There are training standards, right? From some of our,
There are now,
they
yeah.
don't specifically address how necessary. It's more about number of hours, broad topic competencies that have to be looked at, right? If I'm not
Oh
mistaken.
yeah, there are, for sure. But I mean more, what do you talk about with your students when you talk about advocacy? Because I think, and not even just your students, but for even more importantly, people that work in the hospital, the supervisors, the managers of interpreters. What do you talk about when you bring on a new interpreter? What does advocacy mean? Because it continues to be in a lot of parts of the country, the person didn't have a course. They're not certified, they didn't take a course, and so they're learning what advocacy means from their other interpreters, their boss, and there's just no consensus. And I think the idea at some point was to create some kind of certification, or a standard way of how to talk about these issues, so that interpreters could be tested on those as well. I mean, there is a little bit of it in the certification exam, but yeah, that's one thing. I think in addition to this idea that she talked about video remote interpreting giving more access to the patients to a language like to English, right, for somebody who speaks Nepali, and the more work for her, an expanded sense of work, and then of course something more to be able to teach her students, is the connection of joy, and how that just made her day. That story about New Year's Eve where she got to interpret, I think that was the birth, and she was like, it was just the best thing to do. And that's really, I think that's really neat. And then the equal joy when she interpreted for someone who was dying, but it was, it came from knowing that this, I think it was a husband or a father, was able to be so involved in that process because of her.
Yeah, I wish I could quote. I was listening to a podcast recently, an On Being podcast, which you all know that I like those episodes, where someone was really teasing out and making clear. I forgot what he so eloquently said about joy, but what was left very clear in my mind is that joy and happiness are just not akin, which is how you can get joy from the honor of being involved in that situation. And this is, Elena, thank you for bringing it back to that, because this is what I have always loved and continue to love about where I have the bulk of my experience, about the healthcare setting. Yeah, let me stop there.
We haven't heard from you in a while, Liz.
Yeah, I've been listening.
I know.
Yeah, the bringing it, just kind of to dovetail off of your last point, Elena, that was something that really struck me about Bindiya's storytelling about her work remotely, is that I didn't, I was kind of waiting to hear something like, well, I missed the connection, or, I missed something, because we hear a lot of that. But that experience really resonated with me, that she, even being remote, feels that connection with the people she's interpreting for, and does feel that joy. And I think that, and then also thinking about the training piece, and Bindiya as a trainer and us as trainers, and how do we help shape trainees and newer interpreters understanding of what our role is and how it feels to be an interpreter. Because I think that's important too, to be able to find joy even in those, or maybe especially in those difficult moments. There's an experience that I had as a new interpreter where I was for hours. I was with a family in labor and delivery, and then the baby was stillborn, and then, the nurses come in, and then the chaplain comes in, and it was so, I think I was like 25 years old or something, like, and unfortunately though, um, I I called the owner of the very small agency at the time afterwards, who was always available to talk to the interpreters, and he told me, wow, what a tough experience for you, but what a great thing. Like, I'm so glad that you were there. And I think that, as trainers and kind of leaders in the interpreting community, I think it's important to yeah, just help shape newer people's mindsets surrounding interpreting and what we're there to do and what it feels like. And it's okay if it's hard, and it's okay to feel joy through that connection and seeing people connect even in difficult times. So Bindiya's the whole interview, I think, really captured that. And so I think I really, really appreciated that.
Yeah, she was wonderful. I had presented with her on remote interpreting at the Paving the Way conference, and we prepared ahead of time, and she was sharing these stories, and that's when I was like, I knew like she would be great for the podcast, because she had such a joyful experience. And you're right, Liz, like that's something that I had never really thought about when talking to students about that, because we, especially in healthcare interpreting, you talk about the difficulty and of managing your emotions, the difficulty of remaining impartial, and including, impartial in a sense of, if you disagree or if you feel strongly. But feeling strongly could be just being incredibly moved, either positively or negatively, and then having to remember that you don't want to change what you're saying or how you're saying it because of that, and being very aware of it. But I had never really, thought about that connection to also talk about the cultivating joy in it, instead of just saying, well, this is something that's going to be difficult, and you need to prepare and do all these things so that when this difficult moment happens, you're ready, and you can put on your armor and like hold back your emotion, and which is important to a big extent, because if the interpreter breaks down in a setting like that, they won't have the access. And so it's not, that's equally important, or probably the primary thing that's important in that moment. But yeah, that it's remembering that it's not about everything being good. And this is a trick question kind of that I have for my students, that I have in one of their quizzes in one of my classes, which is like,
Listen up,
true.
listen up, Elena students.
Yeah,
Cheat
listen,
sheet.
this is
Who are
to
watching?
see. Now I'm going to do a quiz to see if any of my students, because Caitlin was my student, but she's already graduated from the program. Yeah, to see if they're listening, which I don't think they are. Is true or false question about, in a healthcare, the goal of interpreting is, I don't know, I can't remember if it's in healthcare or court, that the yeah, it must be healthcare, that the patient, or that the outcome is a good outcome, that the patient feels happy, or has a positive outcome of this. And it's kind of this trick question, because a lot of them say yes, and it's like, no. And I can't remember, the wording is a little bit better than that, but the idea behind it, I think you get, which is, we're not there, and I tell them this, we're not there to make this a good experience. We're not there to take a doctor, or a staff member, or a family member, or anyone who's being inappropriate, or who's being mean or grumpy, and make them a nicer person, make them a less whatever person, so that it's better, so that this patient has a nice experience, a smiley face experience. that's not what we're there for. Ideally, the staff, in many ways, that's what they're there for. We know that patients that feel heard and, feel heard are going to have a better experience regardless, even if they're receiving bad news. But we can't filter that. And
Yeah.
yet, so it's like there will be so many times where the bulk of it is bad, because very sad things happen like that. But
Right.
English speakers have that too, and
Yeah.
they anyone needs to have that full experience of being in that moment, being in a sorrowful moment, and yet understanding what's going on and being heard, right?
Yeah, it returns us, I think, to the really useful framework of communicative autonomy. And that's really astute, Elena, because, I think in the past I've used that idea of a positive healthcare outcome to try to approach the difference, to try to get to the difference really more as a marker and to mark what is different about the healthcare context as opposed juxtaposed with the court, with the conference, which is there is one, we don't have the power to make it. Okay, so positive, one has nothing to do with the mandate on me as an interpreter. It is not talking about good or nice, which is far beyond our control, to create a nice experience out of what is arguably, usually a very shitty experience. Sorry for the family listening. So out of our control. But I think when that phrase is used, it's more to point to the idea that this is a collaborative setting and that as a member of the team, the communication goal, usually of both parties, is focused around the healthcare, is focused on collaborating to communicate, to hopefully, because that's the difference, that the patient and the doctor are aligned. They may have different opinions about how to get there, but they are aligned in that the point of the interaction is to try to gain access to the health services, right? And hopefully improve health and well-being. That's at a fundamental level. So that's the north for the meta level of the encounter. But we as an interpreter, our job is to understand that that's a goal and then always return, to communicative autonomy. I wanted to tie in a couple, go back to this, for lack of a better term, is called the advocacy role as defined, which is such a messy term and requires so much work around it, which is why I think we're all working to try to lay out a better framework. But I wanted to say it's no surprise to me that it's surfacing now, because it does seem to be surfacing, bubbling to the surface in many ways, in my own mind, in the minds of professional associations. And I think, given that social justice has been and needs to be supercharged, I think that at the wider level in the United States politically right now, I think there's a connection there as to why, because there's a motivation that can be felt in the culture for increasing social justice. And so every profession is looking deeply at themselves and saying, how does the social justice mandate that is in our, boiling in our cultural blood right now, how can that be applied to my work, to the majority of the time that I spend my day, which is in professional endeavors, is the majority of time that we spend our days, right? And so I'd love to hear from you all about, what I think is so beautiful about Bindiya is that she obviously comes with a social justice bent. And what she did is understanding the way interpreting functions and the way it has traditionally been taught. She said, okay, how can I find an outlet for this social justice bent? And she applied the advocacy role to other interpreters. She's advocating for other interpreters. She created Found in Translation, which is hugely social justice motivated. But I think it's fascinating how she, instead of channeling it and trying to help provide social justice remedies for every patient she worked with, she took that energy and created this really neat organization.
Which is I actually was about to talk about that. If you have something else, I don't want to cut you off right now. And we do have to correct that too, but finish your thought.
Good. Correct me on whatever I'm misspeaking about. But just to tie up one more thing, when I just want to say we as trainers need to be providing, and anyone who's listening who works in this field, contact your trainers, talk to each other, and think about strategies for chaplains. I just didn't want that to get biased, because I remember in my experience, work interpreting for a chaplain requires explicit strategies. More, sure, there's other outliers as well, but it is kind of the one interpreting interaction that if you think you can just walk in and draw on your skills developed thus far, it'll be an uncomfortable. I think it'll leave much to be desired. So if anyone later on and we have time and wants to talk about interpreting for a chaplain, let's revisit that.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I've only had that happen once, but it was, I learned something pretty quickly from it. I just wanted to say, she didn't create Found in Translation, so I don't want to have. Yeah, she joined Found in Translation. In the notes for this, which I'll edit the description of the recording of this live. I'll put in the link to Found in Translation, and then the founder's name, because I can't remember her name right now, but it wasn't Bindiya.
But she was a part of it. I'm not mistaken about that, right?
Oh yeah, no, okay. definitely. No, and it's a big part of what she talked about. And she started as a trainer, and then they promoted her to kind of a senior trainer, and then now she's running it a lot more. I forget what the title was, but it's a really neat organization. I was actually putting a note in there for us to finish up the last 5 minutes here to talk about Found in Translation. And it's a really special organization here in Massachusetts. And because I really like what they've done. I mean, they train refugee women. It's a very, very specific person. They're non-purpose, they're nonprofit, and they provide the stuff that, that this particular type of student needs the most, which, I mean, the childcare is just like, that's amazing. So these women go to class, and during the class they have free childcare, on site, so that they're close to their babies or their children, their younger children. And really, as she phrased it, giving them job placement opportunities. And that's how they see it, is it's another, it's a great opportunity. It's similar, but a much more active training program. But it's similar to this idea of going into high schools, and starting to talk about translation and interpreting as a career, kind of planting the seed, and this is something that you can do. And but then it's it's actually doing that with a subset that's really well poised, especially in a country that has these refugee populations that come up, and you need to train new languages. You have to train people from scratch, so that they can work, and they sometimes just learned English just a few years ago, and American culture, New England culture just a few years ago, and we'll have those issues of connection and impartiality much more at the skin level, very, very much real for them.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk. I was so kind of psyched when I heard that Bindiya was at Found in Translation. I did, oh gosh, it's probably been 3 or 4 years ago now. I did some essay scoring. So through the application process, the women, part of the application is that they write a personal statement. And there are many, 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 many applications. And so they have to be scored by multiple scorers. And I did that a couple times and was really moved by a lot of the personal statements. It was a very difficult task to score those personal statements, but I love I love that it's not just, here's training for people who have language skills. It's also, we're going to support you and provide childcare so that you can actually attend the training. And then afterwards, you're not just on your own. I think this is a big gap I've seen as a trainer, is that we train people and this kind of like let them loose, and they don't have much support from the community. So I love that, that ongoing support that they get after the training is finished.
Yeah, they over the years, I've been tempted multiple times of applying for jobs because they had one that was like alumni coordinator. They have different, which was after after they were hiring somebody to specifically work with them after they had completed the program and to continue networking. And then when Gay Gentes left, they were looking for her position anyway, because they're somewhat local. They're in Boston, but I've been tempted, as I'm tempted, by so many different things in our vast profession. There's so much possibility. Which is a good note to end on, since it is 4:00. The vast numbers of opportunity. But I don't want to have the final word ever on anything or here. But yeah, if you haven't listened to the episode, I highly encourage you to listen to it. It's a really nice one, and the video will be up soon. That was one thing that didn't work very well in the Descript, but it's mostly my hardware. So I edited the video already, but it won't export it. But that's coming soon, probably within a week. I'll have that on our YouTube channel too, so that you can watch it in the YouTube channel if you want. And if not, you can go to our website to see listen to all of our podcasts.
I'll help you not have to have the last word, and I'll try to bring it home. Bindiya got me thinking a lot about social justice as it applies to our work, and it occurred to me as we were talking, for someone like me, in the way my life, given my background and the way my life has come together, for me and for a lot of us right now, social justice is a lot about listening, a lot about the service of listening right now. And so it occurred to me that actually we as interpreters, we're doing the most extreme form of listening, active listening, that there is. So that's a wonderful reminder for myself, that particularly in the healthcare setting, really in all interpreting settings, we're in line with the social justice mission in the simple fact of listening, of the active listening that we have to do as our job. The other connection that I wanted to make that I thought was really beautiful as I was reviewing the transcript of the interview is, like the UNHCR comes out, the High Commission on Refugees, and here we have Bindiya, laboring with the people whose lives are ordered and in some way influenced by decisions made in international forums, such as, the UN High Commission on High Commissioner, High Commission, whatever it is, on refugees. And it's so neat to see how interpreters in different settings touch each other's work. I mean, when those decisions are made, interpreters had a hand in interpreting those discussions. So that's a really kind of hidden connection between interpreters in different fields that I don't think we think about, how our work as interpreters actually inform the work of interpreters in other settings.
Yeah, nice. Thank you, Laura. Do you want to say anything else, Liz, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for this interview, Elena. I loved it. I love when I get to edit the transcript because I get to really kind of dig into it. And thank Bindiya for her time and for being so generous with sharing her stories. One of the social media posts I made addressed how she really does have this magical storytelling gift, and it just really helped me remember that interpreters fundamentally, we are storytellers. So thank you both for this great episode. I loved it.
Well, thank you both for your continued support of this project. So with that, I will say goodbye. And I think once again, I have to wait until the little bit of delay on YouTube goes to end it. So I'll probably make a gesture. I think that'll be the easiest thing to do. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Laura. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks with a live debrief. The next podcast episode comes out on September 16th. And then we'll have a live debrief probably on the 23rd or perhaps the 30th, which is International Translators Day. But we'll keep you posted. So follow us on all of our social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because that way, whenever we go live, it just pops up on your phone or your device, and you can just click on it right away. Thank you. Okay.